Hello everyone, welcome back to How to Be Irish. I'm your host Una Harty, and today's episode we're going to be looking at the Norman invasion of Ireland, but more specifically we're going to be looking at the Lecale Peninsula, which is up in the northeast of Ireland. I've got a very special guest in for that. He's an expert in that area and he's going to be telling us all about that. But before we do that, I just wanted to say thank you for sticking around for season 2 so far. And I'll see you again next week with another episode on another topic related to Irish culture and how it affects us today. Duane Fitzsimons is a 7th generation farmer's son. He takes great pride in showcasing his beloved home, the Lecale Peninsula, to visitors. But what is so unique about the Lecale Peninsula? As the burial place of Ireland's 3 patron saints, the area is rich in history and folklore, dating back over 1600 years and more. His guided tours along the Lecale Way offer a chance to explore places of battle and shipwreck. The area is home to medieval Norman castles that still stand today, forming a ring of defence around the peninsula. Lecale is located on the east coast of Ireland in the Mourne Gullion Strangford Global Geopark. Duane, you're so welcome to How to Be Irish. How are you getting on today?
Not too bad, I've been out walking all morning, so
Oh,
better sit
brilliant.
down and have a rest.
Exactly. Were you doing a tour this morning?
No, I was doing a recce for work, so this is kind
Very
of
good.
the decompressing work.
Okay, good stuff, good stuff. Well, we might get into it. So we will talk a little bit about the Normans in Ireland. Of course, we all learn about it in school, but could we give us a little bit of a refresher of how they came to Ireland and perhaps how they made their way up north?
Yeah, so throughout my whole life, I've always been aware of the fact that my surname is Norman. I remember in my grandparents' house that my dad lives in now, there was a book, and it was the history of the Diocese of Down, and in that it said that we were one of a number of families that came with it's framed as an Anglo-Norman knight, John de Courcy. And it's always kind of fascinated me because that's always stayed with me. But my surname being Fitzsimons, it's like one of the most common ones from that entire area. Like if you met another Fitzsimons from that area, there's a chance you would know how you're related to them. And people always ask, "Oh, which branch are you?" Because it's just so common. So it's always been kind of in my psychology that I am of Norman descent. But I've recently done like a deeper dive into that over the last number of months, just on TikTok and Instagram. There's a map that shows the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland is what is called. But the map's technically incorrect, and I just wanted to get to try and demystify up who these people were. So it's not really framed very well in the education system in the north. I remember it was one of the things we learned was John de Courcy, because we've got Carrickfergus Castle at Carrickfergus, and at the end of first year you would always go up to Carrickfergus Castle for the tour of the castle. But who he was isn't really very well framed in terms of his familial connections or anything like that. And this map had a number of different names of knights who'd come across from Britain anyway, I'll put it that way. But psychologically, you need to think about who they were and what they would have identified as, because they were in England from about 1066, and they would have visited them before that. And prior to that, you have them in Normandy, and they've been visiting Normandy from Scandinavia, but you've also got the Hiberno Norse in there as well. So they were essentially Vikings. They came in Viking longships. It's like technologically, it hasn't advanced much beyond that, but they had changed sociologically. You can see that because prior to their arrival in England, they would have went by names as such and such a son, i.e., that was who their father was before them, or even such and such as daughter instead, if they were female. And it's really kind of obvious when you look at their names because they've started to put the name of the place that they're coming from on it. And it wasn't really until I was at a talk by Steve Flanders a number of years ago that he said he was John D. Courcy, but he wasn't John D. Courcy. He was John of Courcy, and Courcy is a place in Calvados in Normandy. And when you drop in there, you can actually see the castle that family came from.
Mm.
And you can see, therefore, that they've started to put down roots in Normandy, and they're identifying themselves by those roots rather than the forebears, so that not going any longer by their father's name or anything like that. But that's all a bit muddy then when it comes to who they're living alongside here in Ireland as also. So the first kind of incursion into Ireland is by Strongbow, so Richard de Clare. And basically, Dermot MacMurrough has lost control of his lands in Wexford, and he was the King of Leinster. And he goes to King Henry II in England to try and rally up some support to get his lands back. And he doesn't get any success with Henry, but he meets Richard, and Richard is promised Dermot MacMurrough's daughter Aoife's hand in marriage, and his titles therefore through her like inheritance of taking on the kingship of Leinster. And he comes and he drives off Rory O'Connor, and then Dermot MacMurrough dies in 1171, and Richard inherits through Aoife's right to be the King of Leinster. And this causes a bit of confusion and concern for Henry II over in England. So then you get Henry coming over, and he comes to check up on what Strongbow's at, because Strongbow has not just come in and taken up the kingship of Leinster. He goes off and he tries to lay siege on Dublin. And Dublin is an interesting kind of place at that time. So it was under the control of the King of the Isles, or the King of Dublin. It was a separate kingdom in itself, and that's really the opportunity that Normans seen within Ireland. It wasn't one unified territory; it was a number of different territories, all vying for their own superiority.
So
So,
just to ask on that, so Dublin was kind of more so, when you say Isles, do you mean Isle of Man?
so the Isle of Man and the Outer Hebrides were all part of one
Okay.
kingdom, and
Wow.
what's interesting about that is that John de Courcy marries Africa, whose father is Godfred of Man, but he was the King of Dublin at one point, and through a number of different wars and battles, lost control of it. So
Hmm.
he's an interesting character in his own right, because he lets his daughter marry this Norman knight, but there's an allegiance there that's kind of very interesting to
Mm.
untangle. So when Henry comes across to Ireland, he comes over with Hugh de Lacy, and Hugh de Lacy's from the north of England. So Strongbow was the second Earl of Pembroke, which means that he was from Wales, so he's a Cambro Norman. So he's not an Anglo Norman at all, but he's
Mm.
one of the Normans of the Welsh Marshes, I think is the term they use for them. And I only come across the term Cambro Norman when I was down in Wexford, because I always had heard of the Anglo Normans. But when you look at who their allegiances are with, it's not necessarily to the king. Richard is seeing an opportunity for himself to have his own fiefdom within Ireland, and that's what he's like tried to grasp, while still holding the lands in Wales. But when Henry comes over, he comes to check up on what Strongbow's doing, because he's laid siege on Dublin and is therefore expanding his territory. So even though today Dublin is in Leinster, um, at that time it was a separate kingdom, and Richard has tried to claim that for himself. But you also get this resurgence of the Irish kind of coming back against these Normans who are invading. So you get a number of people who have come to try and lay claim on Dublin, and they're bolstered up by the King of Man as well. So he's there sending a fleet across to make sure that Dublin cannot be captured by these Normans. So Hugh de Lacy then, for his service to the king, is granted lands in Meath, and he starts building a castle at Trim. Um, then you have other kind of Cambro Normans working away through the south kind of coast into Cork and to Limerick, and you got a few interesting characters like Walter de Burgh, who are you've Walter de Burgh and Theobald Fitzwalter. But Theobald then goes on to take on the surname of Butler. So they were literally the people who gave the king his first glass of wine at his coronation. So they're very important people to him.
Mm.
But Hugh de Lacy takes on the title of the Viceroy of Ireland also. So this whole thing about them being Henry II's deputy in Ireland, Henry II believes he's got claim to Ireland because it's a papal grant that he had. Basically, the Pope says Ireland is his property, which obviously is contentious as well. So these Normans are starting to try and lay claim to these separate kingdoms. And the guy who I come with, John de Courcy, or who my family came with, not me necessarily. There's one of the stories says that he was in Dublin in 1171 with Henry II, and at that time he tells Henry II of the opportunity in Ulster, because Ulster is seen as being the most Irish and most difficult to conquer. But within that, because everyone's vying for superiority up in Ulster, there's an opportunity there that you can go in and upset the apple cart and grab a bit of land for yourself. But John is a very interesting person because his family's seat was at Stoggersea on the Severn Estuary, and his family then controlled lands through marriage up near the Scottish borders, and that's where the trade routes from Europe came through across to Ireland to Dublin. So he had a really good awareness of the situation politically up in Ulster, and he's seen that opportunity for himself. So it's quite interesting. So I always talk about tours of the Lecale Peninsula, and it's this idea that it is a peninsula is the most like significant thing about it. So we're on the east coast, and we're not the furthest east. That's up on the Ards Peninsula, just to the north. And on the east coast, we have Dundrum Bay to the south and the Mourne Mountains, and then south of that, you've got the Cooley Peninsula. So you've got this range of mountains that stops invaders coming northwards. And then to the north, we've got Strangford Lough, and Strangford Lough was formerly far more extensive around the area of Downpatrick. And because of that tidal nature being cut off in three sides, this gave a very easily defensible peninsula. So it's a very low-lying peninsula, but it has some very strategic hills within that. And anciently, it was the seat of Celtor Martu, and he was one of the Red Branch Knights. So you've got Conor McNessa from Armagh playing into this. You've got Cuchulainn down in the Cooley Peninsula and the Ring of Gowlin as well. But you've got this stronghold at Downpatrick called Rath Kelter. And Kelter's successors then were the Dal Feta. So they're the descendants of Feta Finn, who I think was a 7th century warrior. But the name Lecale comes around in the 9th century because it was a co-kingdom that basically was covering large areas of County Down that was divided into two territories. And Lech is half and Cale is a corruption of Cahill. Some people say it's Lecale. I don't really like to correct them because they're closer to me in terms of the Irishness of it. Um, and it was a kingdom that Cahill and another guy called Madigan controlled. And Madigan's peak is at Cave Hill in Belfast. And in that area, geographically, the Belfast Hills would be the kind of physical northern barrier to that kingdom going any further north.
Okay.
Um, so by the time of the 12th century, well, we'll go back to the start of the 12th century in 1103, there's a Viking king killed in Downpatrick, and his name's Magnus Berfut. Now, he's the king of Norway. He's the last Norwegian king to die on battle, and he was in Downpatrick having done a cattle raid, and the Irish ambushed him, and he had two spear wounds through both thighs, but it was an axe to the neck that ended him. So if you're on the outskirts of Downpatrick, you'll find this place called Magnus's Grave, and it's where the last king of Norway to die in battle was buried offshore in Ireland. So there's that connection, but that Norwegian king connection also ties back to the kings of Man because the kingdom that Magnus had included the kingdom of the Isles and Dublin and right up to Norway. So there's a real kind of
Okay. Wow.
allegiance. It's very, very interesting politically because there's a lot of interconnections. And when John de Courcy arrives in Ulster, Magnus is probably about just over 70 years in the ground. So this is still something that would be within tangible memory of people. So it'd still be well enough known. And that's what's really interesting about Lecale. Where he's buried is a former island in Strangford Lough, which is about 4 miles inland from where Strangford Lough finishes today, because there was some reclamation of the sea floor down that way. Um, so within Lecale, you've got like a capital town called Downpatrick, which it didn't take on until John de Courcy gave it that name. And in the town, we have two forts. So it's known when John de Courcy arrives as Dún Leith Glesh, which means fort of the two halves of the chain. So there's a legend attached to St. Patrick in that he had sent an angel to break the bonds of the two sons of Deku, and they carried these chains back to Downpatrick, and one was kept on one hill and one was kept at the other hill, and that's where that's said to have come from. But it refers to two forts within the town. And if you go back to before the Vikings, to the early Christian period, this is where St. Patrick landed. It's where he set up his mission, and it's where his conversion of the Irish to Christianity took hold. Though about a mile outside of Downpatrick, got Saul. That's the place where he started out in his mission. That's where he died, and he's buried at Downpatrick. But because of the Viking raids, St. Columba, who'd been buried on Iona, is sent back to Ireland in about 1177, or sorry, 877. And St. Bridget, who's buried at Kildare, her relics are sent north to Downpatrick as well. So the Dalfata, who are in Downpatrick, have this fleet of ships that can fend off the Vikings, and they did it a few times. So it was seen to be that the greatest protection they could be afforded was to be found in Downpatrick. And because of the trade routes across the Irish Sea, John de Courcy knew this before he arrived there.
Mm-hmm.
So he used this as a political kind of game when he came and conquered the area as well.
It's so full of history. Like the fact, first of all, just the fact that the three saints are buried there, I had no idea. I suppose I hadn't really even thought with, very deeply where they might be buried, or even if their remains exist at all. What does remain of them there?
Okay, interesting question. So when John Dorsey arrives, he finds that they're not known where it's not known where the grave is. So he instructs the bishop to set out and find it. The bishop has to spend 6 years until he has success one day and finds it. But what's even more interesting about this is that after they are found, you've got the shrine of St. Patrick's forearm, which used to have the forearm bone in it. And because it was used in blessings and water was poured through it, that eroded the bone away, but the reliquary still exists. St. Patrick's jawbone is still held by the diocese down in Connor, and I've seen it myself. It goes on tour, but it's an interesting one. So it used to be looked after by a family by the name of Savage, and they were of Anglo-Norman descent, and they lived outside of Downpatrick, a place called Duntark. And when they were emigrating, they used to take a tooth with them from the job.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So you've got the those are two that come to mind straight away. There is a skull of St. Patrick, which a portion of I think is within the diocese, but I think the main portion of the skull is in Rome. But St. Bridget is the most fascinating one. So St. Bridget, her skull is in Lumiar, which is in Lisbon, in
Mm-hmm.
Portugal. And I'd seen this number of years ago on YouTube. It was a very grainy old video, and it showed you the chapel where her skull is. And on the outside of the chapel, there's three tombs, and the third tomb was the third knight who'd brought her skull there. And these were the Knights Templar, the Knights of St. John the Baptist. The church is the Church of St. John the Baptist. But basically, King Denis of Portugal wrote to Rome asking for a relic for his church, and Rome wrote to Ireland, and these three knights came with the skull of St. Bridget. Now, I think at this time, Dundrum Castle outside of Newcastle and just north of the Mourne Mountains was under the control of the Knights Templar, and Dundrum's about 4 or 5 miles from Downpatrick. So I think they've gone to the cathedral, asked for the skull, and then they've gone to Portugal with the skull. And when the third one died, his inscription on his tomb explains these are the three knights from Ireland who brought the relic of the Blessed Virgin Bridget to this church and whose relic's inside. So the reliquary that it's in is from the 1700s, but her skull's there. And what really fascinated me about this was back in 2017 when I went there, the church has a cross outside the front of it. And on St. Bridget's Day, they would walk cattle in. It used to be on the outskirts of Lisbon. They used to walk cattle in and walk around the cross to get a blessing for the year. And I just like, you couldn't get any more Irish than that. It was really,
No,
really
the
bizarre.
the cattle and everything. I had no idea it was
Yeah.
in Lisbon. Was it just that there was trade routes and connections through Christianity between Portugal and Ireland then?
This is another random Lecale connection. So in Lecale, we have a village called Strangford. And Strangford is a very quiet harbour today. It has the world's oldest ferry service running in it. So there's a ferry that connects Strangford to Portaferry, and that was documented by John de Courcy in 1180. And he's just
Wow.
documenting it at that time, he's not setting it up. So it predates probably the one on the Mersey, which is said to be the oldest. Strangford used to be one of the major ports of Ulster, and they used to export 1/3 of all Irish exports of grain from Strangford, and most of those went to Portugal. But I don't think that's where the connection comes. It's a bit too late. When I went there to Lisbon, I was told by the sacristy office that the Portuguese believed that Bridget's mother was Portuguese, and that she was taken by Irish pirates and sold into slavery. So she was the patron saint of children born into difficult circumstances. And the reason for that is because she had such a difficult childhood herself, because she was
Okay.
a daughter of one of her father's many wives or concubines, if we want to put it that way. So they see her as their own daughter in a way. And I was really put to shame because when I was there in 2017, they were about to have a 9-day festival for Bridget. Now I know that
Wow.
in the Republic there is the bank holiday now, but this was a 9-day festival back in 2017, and I was just really blown away. So the Irish Council would come along to that, and they would have Irish dancing in this church. They would make some Bridget's
Mhm.
crosses, and it's like, whoa.
Wow, I had no idea about that because this
Yeah.
the bank holiday is only a recent enough thing as well. Like I feel like we're only really starting to give her a bit more time in celebration, but we certainly don't have 9 days, that's for sure. When you talk about Ireland, obviously you mentioned about the Hebrides and the Isle of Man, that being part of the Kingdom of Dublin and such, and then you have all the different kingdoms around, like Leinster didn't include Dublin at the time. Is there any way to, I suppose, explain what the concept of Ireland was at the time? Was it the island itself? What did it include or not include?
So the idea of there being a 32 county Ireland didn't exist before the Normans. Really, it was a lot of different minor kingdoms vying for superiority within their own kind of context. So you would have had a superior kingdom in Ulster, you would have had a superior kingdom in Leinster and Munster and Connaught. And among those, you would have people vying to be the High King of Ireland. And it's really politically sensitive, and that's what the Normans seen as their opportunity to come in and disrupt that. Because if you can get into a minor kingdom and put someone off their land, then it's your way into the succession through Ireland, realistically. So when I started doing like a deeper dive into the Normans, I come to settle on the idea that they were just Normans. They didn't have any particular allegiances to anybody. But if you could align yourself to King Henry II, you could find yourself being granted lands through him. But you could also conquer these lands for yourself. And their main allegiances really were to their families back in who were living in England. But also those families still had connections back to Normandy. This is only 100 years after the Battle of Hastings. And a lot of these families still, because of the Angevin Empire, which Henry II was in control of and the king of, he had much kind of grander kind of empire right down into southern France, including Normandy as well. So it's a very unusual way of framing it within our modern heads, because we
Mm.
just think it was the Kingdom of England, but it wasn't the Kingdom of England. It was the Kingdom of England, Normandy, and the lands to the south of that. So he'd married, and through that marriage he'd married Eleanor of Aquitaine, and she brought with her dower lands, and that included this kingdom to the south of the Duchy of Normandy as well. So it's a very extensive kingdom, and it's only within the next generation. So you got Henry II control of this Angevin empire. He passes it on to his son. The son passed away without rightful heir. Then you get Richard the Lionheart taken over, and then after Richard, you get King John. But King John is Prince John, the same character in the Robin Hood story. So a lot of people don't make that connection, but the Robin Hood story is not about robbing the rich to feed the poor. It's literally about the Saxons hating their new Norman overlords. It's about them trying to get them out of power and reclaim England back for themselves. So the antagonists in both instances, in terms of this viewpoint of the Normans being the antagonists within Ireland, is the same as the antagonists who are there
Mm.
in England also. So we've got something in
Mm.
common with them way back then.
Yeah, we do. That's for sure. Yeah. And so the common phrase, the Normans became more Irish than the Irish themselves. Do you know where that idea comes from? You mentioned there was resistance to them coming in. It wasn't invasion after all, but how did they start to culturally assimilate and what did that look like?
Okay, if you look at John de Courcy's example, it's really fascinating. So he had grown up in Cumbria, just across the Irish Sea. And between Cumbria and here, you have the Isle of Man. So he, in about 1180, set up a marriage for himself with Africa, who was the daughter of the King of Man. So she was a princess. And most Norman lords married into Irish families, so they would have married princesses of Ireland. But John de Courcy looked across the sea, and he's like culturally set himself up to have really good defenses in the Scottish Lowlands through a marriage of an aunt. He had childhood friends in Cumbria. He had a father-in-law and a brother-in-law on the Isle of Man, and he also had another brother-in-law at Howth, so he was Amoricus Tristan. and he had all of that, but also then had the family seat down at Stoggersea in Somerset as well. So he had very much control over the Irish Sea and could rely on a fleet of ships if he needed it at any point. But in terms of other Norman lords, they married into these Irish families and legitimized themselves in that way. When they arrive here, they're speaking Norman French, but within a few generations, they're speaking in Irish. They're following kind of Irish hereditary practices. So the strongest son will always inherit rather than the eldest son. And that's a really fascinating idea, because I wasn't really aware of primogeniture being a legal system. I just thought it was, the done thing. But no, it was legally, if you were not the firstborn, you had to go out and you had to fight for your cause to claim your own lands. So that's why you get these Norman knights seeing Ireland as this opportunity to claim lands for themselves. And many of them came to Ireland because they seen that opportunity to set themselves up and get married, rather than having to go off onto the Crusades or become a man at war at the beck and call of the king. So it was really interesting to learn that as well, that they were driven by this idea that they didn't want to be at war all the time. They needed to find something for themselves to settle down, and had a real opportunity to set themselves up with these minor kingdoms.
Okay, so Ireland was almost seen as this, I suppose, golden opportunity at the time, and the fact that they could gain power and lands through marriage, or as you said, the idea of the sons. It doesn't have to be the firstborn son. Is that tanistry? Is that the right term for that?
It's primogeniture is the firstborn son has to inherit, but I think in Irish it would be tanistry. Yeah, so it's to do
Okay.
with the passing on of lands. It usually went to the strongest son or the strongest cousin, which is quite interesting because the symbol of Ulster is the red hand of Ulster. And technically, the story of the Red Hand of Ulster is that the O'Neills were having a row among themselves for superiority, and whoever got to touch Ulster first in this race that they had, I can't remember where it was exactly, but whoever touched Ulster first would be the Premier O'Neill. And one of them realized he wasn't going to win the race, so he cut his hand off and threw it. But because he cut his hand off, he technically like maimed himself, and therefore shouldn't have been able to inherit. But I think it's because of the honor of having done that deed. That's why they got it. Even within the Normans who settled in Ulster at the Irish Peninsula, their surname is Savage, connection to the same savages who had the job on St. Patrick. But they had a war, like a row within their own family as to who would be the superior savage, which sounds a bit funny when you say it that way, but anyway, it's just their surname, which meant that there were people from the woods. They weren't necessarily from a town as such. That's where the surname is said to have come from, but they had this vying for superiority within their own family, and they had a race back probably from somewhere like Armagh to Portaferry, and whoever got to Portaferry first would be the Premier Savage. And one of them heard the ferry wasn't running, and he went up around the Arch Peninsula and down the peninsula. The other one got to Strangford, seen the ferry wasn't running, and says, "I've had enough. I'm not giving up now." He jumped into the water and swam across and became the savages of the Ards seated at Portaferry then after that. So
Mm.
that kind of idea of fighting for your superiority and being the kind of head of the family is what the Normans took on to themselves. So that's the savages would be one example of them being more Irish than the Irish themselves. Another one is that when the Reformation came about, Henry VIII tried to reform the church within Ireland, but Ireland's a largely Catholic country, and um, well, it remained as such throughout the Reformation. And despite so many efforts to try and stop the people being of the Roman Catholic faith, um, they held on to it. But the Normans were able to find themselves in this really strange position where they could claim allegiance to the king and at the same time hold on to their Catholic faith. So the savages of the Ards were Catholics who were seen to be, by the time of Elizabeth I, people be getting rid of because they were much more aligned to the Irish way of thinking. And in about 1601, you get a new Lord Deputy of Ireland coming over, and he's Mountjoy. And Mountjoy is a very cruel and vindictive, war-minded man, and he gets to understand very quickly the setup of the Irish court, and he actually employs a fired satirist called Angus O'Daly. He was a bard for one of the big families in Ireland, and he employs Angus to write a series of satires about the Irish on their lands and their estates in Ireland. And in that, he frames the savages as this Irish family, but don't forget it that they're Norman. So he literally says, he literally calls them the foreign hangman, Far Karskart. The whole rhyme set up in Irish is Ard Ulach an Gorta, which means in the Ards of Ulster, destitute and starving, Vic and Savashi and Crokergal, the grandson of the son of Savage, the foreign hangman. And the grandson is like trying to say that they are the least of them all. Their family were great before them, but look at them now, they're so diminished and like such a
Mm.
minor kind of power. And then goes on to say that he's for Karskar Barney Lahirking, which means he makes his living by smashing mollusks at the sea with a mallet. So their Irishness is used against them and employed as a
Okay.
tactic to try and disgrace them.
So around that time, you said the early 1600s, this was the view of the English, would you say?
The the Lord Deputy is Mountjoy Charles Blunt, and when he arrives in Ulster, he arrives because the O'Neills are laying siege on Ardglass, which is a village in the Lecale area. And Ardglass is really an interesting town. It's very much off the beaten path, but it has 6 castles in it. And
Wow.
at that time, there was a family by the name of Jordan had the largest, kind of most defensible castle, and they were under siege from the O'Neills. So you get this kind of weird juxtaposition of two contrasts and arguments. So the Jordans were under siege from 1598 to 1601, and were only relieved when Mountjoy came in. And Mountjoy drove them off and fought such a bloody battle that for an entire generation there was no children born, because all that were left were very young boys, and it was until they came of age that people started to have families again. And that would be one of Mountjoy's very brutal tactics, to try and wipe out everything. He would burn crops and make sure that it was very hard to make a living for a season at least. And
Hmm.
he employed very, very brutal tactics. Like,
Okay.
it doesn't get much more brutal than him.
Yeah, my God. Was this just before the plantation of Ulster, or was the beginning of it?
So this is in the 9 Years' War. So the 9 Years' War
Okay.
ends with the flight of the Earls, and it's in the flight of the Earls that the plantation of Ulster then is done, because there's no Irish kind of the, the the noble Irish have gone to the continent, and there's
Hmm.
a power vacuum. So therefore, the lands are taken by the crown and resettled with other kind of settlers from England and Scotland. But where we are in County Down was settled privately, so it was done through Scots planters coming over. So you get another kind of character, Con O'Neill, up at Castlereagh and Clandeboy, and he's taken off in the charge of treason, and he pleads and makes a plea that he'll give over parts of his lands to a Scottish settler if he can get his lands back, and that's a guy by the name of Montgomery. Another guy by the name of Hamilton works out this is happening. He muscles in on the deal, so you get Hamilton Montgomery coming to settle the Ards Peninsula and the area just to the north of the Lecale, and that's why we've got a very strong Ulster Scots connection in that area as well. But it was privately settled,
Mm.
not necessarily done by plantation.
Okay, I see. You mentioned to me beforehand how you have discovered a southeast dialect of Irish, although you said perhaps maybe a little bit more related to Manx Gaelic. Could you tell me a little bit about that and how that came about?
So it was quite interesting because I've had this book from about 2016, 2015, 2016, and it's the journal of my great 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 grandfather. And he was the secretary to the Board of Health for Ardglass during the cholera epidemic of the 1830s. And he, on the inside cover of it, opens it with the words Céad Míle Fáilte, but it's not spelt the way that I would have learned Céad Míle Fáilte. It's Céad Míle Fáilte. And I had I don't know exactly why I'd done it, but I remember a number of years ago being told that my grandmother's family were brought over from the Isle of Man because they spoke the same dialect of Irish or Gaelic that they spoke in Lecale. And they were brought over by the wards, who were the landlords, to try and coerce the Irish to pay their rents. So it's another difficult family history that I have to grapple with. But in that, when I did the check on where you find that surname using the barrygriffin.com site, you only find it in County Down. And that just seemed to me quite strange. So I then checked what the Manx Gaelic for Céad Míle Fáilte is, and it's Céad Míle Fáilte. And it's basically the same as what was written in the front page of this. So I could talk to a few people on TikTok just around that and whether there is a possibility that this is correct. And even people on Instagram were coming back to me and no, I remember reading the dialect was the exact same. So I had to then try and find a source for it. And the source that I found was the place names database. So through placenamesni.org, you've got a number of recordings of a place name right back to the 6th or 7th century because it's recorded as early as that. But most of them are from the 15 and 1600s. And within that, I was able to find things like in Irish, the word for hills, knock or crook or something along those lines. But in Manx Gaelic, it's cronk. And I found that being one of the examples that we would have referred to hills as crunks or cruns rather than crooks or knocks. Another one relates to a piece of folklore about a stone called the brogy stone. So in Irish, the word is brogue for your shoe or brogue. But brogy would be the way we'd have said that locally. So it's recorded literally as the brogy stone. And then when I looked at where that is, it's a place called Ballycruttle, alias Ballycrostal. And cruttle, I think I've got this right, is the Irish word for lichen. And crostal is Irish word for moss. So that refers to this being the place you gathered your lichens and your moss. And that was important because that's what you dyed your clothes with. So that's literally where you find that in the landscape. But when you go across to the Isle of Man, you find the same kind of evidence of it there. Another one is, which is really fascinating, goes back to the Normans again. We have a townland in Lecale called Ballykinler. And Ballykinler is in Donegal Irish, Ballyquinler. So there's a que coming in with the CO there. But in Manx Gaelic, it's Kinler. So it's the same kind of corruption of it. Another one is the town of Moville in Donegal. So Moville is the plain of the sacred tree, but in County Down we also have a Movilla, and Villa is the Manx Gaelic for a tree as well. So we've got Ville, which is Bhile, and then at County Down you've got Villa, which is closer to the Manx Gaelic, which is from Bíle, the tree. There's lots of these signifiers to it there.
Do you think it's because there was people coming over from the Isle of Man and they were obviously bringing their Manx Gaelic and it was mixing at that time?
I'm not certain, but I think at one point the Dalfeta, who controlled the territory of Ulla, were also in control of the Isle of Man because you've got the Kinnelloan over in Tyrone and Donegal, and they are adversaries of the Dalfeta. And between the Kinnelloan and the King of Man, they have a marriage. So Africa's father's second wife is a daughter of the King of the Kinnelloan. So you've got marriage allegiances there. And I think it's because the Dalfeta were seen as oppressors to the kings of the Isle of Man because they had formerly ruled them. I think that's where the dialects come from. It's because it was one kingdom across the Irish Sea,
Okay.
in a similar way to the kingdom of Dalriada.
Yeah, that makes sense. Your a lot of your history that you have learned seems to be through the lens of your own family, your own genealogy. Is that how you started to get into it? And what was that journey like for you?
So I've been doing my tours for 10 years now, and I always try and frame Irish history through the lens of my family's history because I have Viking, Norman, Ulster Scots, and Manx all within my family history as well as the Irish diaspora as well. So, in terms of really understanding where you've come from, family history does an awful lot to explain that for you. Like biologically, I think I'm more from County Down than anywhere else on this island. It is, we haven't really migrated very far, and even my own mum's surname, when you put that into the barrygriffin.com site, it comes up in two places, and it only is in Lecale. So you got a northern end and the south end, and that's the height of it. It doesn't appear anywhere else on the island. So I
That's mad.
use I use my own family history to frame the kind of cultural history of Ireland and what's going on at certain time frames.
Let's ask the famous question, which the podcast is named after. What does it mean to you to be Irish?
For me, and I was a bit worried about this question, to be Irish to me is to have a real sense of the place and to understand it throughout all of time, and to understand where its name has come from, who has lived there, and their relationships to their ancestry and their kind of future relationships. So for me, being Irish is, it's about our language, and it's about our culture. And I live in like a contested land. Where I come from would be a largely kind of nationalist area within the jurisdiction, but um, it is a contested land, and it is harder to prove. Well, you shouldn't have to prove it, but sometimes it can be harder for us to prove our Irish identity. But what's really remarkable with that is that my granddad's brother was the first Irish consul to Malawi, when it got independence back in 1965. So you got really weird kind of juxtapositions there all the time.
Mm,
But Irish, being Irish is not one constant thing for me. It's comes from knowing who you are and where you're going to as well.
mm, absolutely. A living and breathing thing that I suppose has the ability to change and move with the times. For anybody who's interested in exploring their own family history and I suppose use it like yourself as a framing Irish history around that, what would you have any tips or recommendations for them?
So I was quite fortunate in that my great grandfather married quite late in life, so he recorded a lot of who his family were before him. He missed out a few of them and had to go and do some detective work. But we are quite fortunate in County Down. There's a great website compiled by a lady from Australia, and she's only married to an Irishman. She's not Irish herself, and well, she's Irish through marriage, and she has created a database of every historical record of a surname of a person and a forename, and you can go through that and work out where they were. And she's got it all indexed by where that source has come from as well. But we are really fortunate in that the National Library has all of the historic church records digitized for baptisms. So that would be one of the main ones that I do. But because I love mapping, one of the main sources for me to get through genealogy and work out where we've come from is on the Ask About Ireland site, where you find the Griffiths valuation. And on that, you'll see literally the piece of ground that your family owned and tilled and made their living from. And when you see that and where you are today, I just love that. And I love mapping as well. So to have that with your own family kind of tied and imprinted onto it is really a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I think something like visual like that is a little bit more tangible, perhaps. What did you say the name of the website was?
So the website you find the Griffiths valuation on is askaboutireland.ie.
Okay,
And
perfect.
if you just Google the Griffiths valuation, it'll come up with that. But it comes up with a series of indexes for the numbers that are on the maps, and then it comes up with the maps itself. But the maps are beautiful. They're like a very kind of cream color with lots of lovely red lines around it. Just like it's visually appealing to me.
Mm.
But the other thing that in terms of genealogy is quite good, and it was a really random TikTok that I did. They say that when you die three times. The first time's your death, the second time is the last person who remembers you dies, and the third time is the last time someone visits your grave. So I go to the grave of our own oldest known family plot, and I start clearing that of a like bush with my dad, and I sit down to talk through who these people are, and having a headstone with their names written on it can be another really beautiful way. So this was the generation that my great grandfather missed out of our family history book, and I've since then gone to put them back into the family history book to the rightful place, because at the end of the day, the house my dad is living in, calling home, was their
Hmm.
home. It literally is their home. I'm seventh generation to live in the house, and the first
Wow.
person buried in the grave was the second generation.
Oh, that is amazing. That is amazing. Fair play to you for doing all that work. There's a lot of time and effort have gone into that. And Congratulations on the 10 years of giving tours in Lecale. To join your tours or learn more about your content and the type of things that you talk about in relation to the Normans, where can they find you?
So I'm on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and the username is Lecale Peninsula, Lecale and Peninsula, and the website is lecalepeninsula.com. But I run all the events that I do through Eventbrite. So yeah, I'm coming up to 10 years of doing this now, and it's been a wonderful journey. I've like taken people from Germany, France, and America across this landscape that they never would have touched upon prior
Mm,
to their arrival in Ireland, and I've left with this really kind of random appreciation of such a beautiful like landscape that nobody is in. That's
mm.
what's really remarkable. Is we're so far off the beaten path that you'll walk a path for about 4 miles and maybe meet one other person on it.
Well,
And it's a
must
coast,
take a trip.
lovely coastal one.
Yeah, I've
You're
seen some
welcome anytime. I know.
photos. Yeah, I'd love to. I've seen photos of you giving your tours. Looks absolutely stunning all along the coast.
It's themed around the kind of St. Patrick idea, those three saints as well, and the idea that we go back to the Normans in this area, and the story of St. Patrick, his kind of tangible, indelible kind of him being the most Irish thing that there is about Ireland, comes from John de Courcy, who told that bishop, "You must find these three saints here. I know they're here. You must find them." And then he has this whole ceremony with a cardinal coming from Rome to inter them into one tomb inside of the cathedral. So
It's
that's
mad.
still the same hill you find today.
I must take a trip up there because I don't know. Like I definitely never heard of this story before, but I have a feeling a lot of other people don't know it as well. So happy to put it out there on the podcast. And thank you so much for sharing it and telling us all about the Lecale Peninsula and the arrival of Normans and such. So thank you so much, Duane. I really appreciate your time today, and good luck with the rest of the tours in the future.
Thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you so much for listening to that episode with Duane. If you want to share it with a friend who you think you might be interested in the history that we spoke about there today, I'd really very much appreciate that. As always, do follow along, subscribe on YouTube, follow the podcast on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts, and share it on your socials. I really appreciate that. It will help me to grow. I really enjoy what I'm doing, so it'll help me to keep doing that. So yeah, thanks a million. Agus feici mé hu ar an céad ceann eile. Slán.